Welcome back. We are busting into section 1.9, and this one is going to be a bit of a bear, so I hope you're ready. Now we are going to go over scopes. This is a bit of an abstract, very abstract concept, so hopefully this makes sense. But essentially, every time you define a variable name and value, that's defined somewhere inside the code. And however your code is structured, the definition of that will only be known inside of its scope. So, what exactly does that mean? Well, let's start with um, something called LEGB. So, this is an acronym. I don't have any cool mnemonic devices. Let's eat green bananas, I guess. That'll be my thing now. Let's eat green bananas equals the scope priority. Okay. I put a little hashtag or octothorpe or pound sign or whatever you want to call it here to denote that this is a comment in my code and is not part of the code to be run. So congratulations, you just learned what comments are. Um, so let's talk about what each of these things means. Well, the L stands for local. The E, the E stands for enclosing. Our G stands for global, and our B stands for built in. So I guess let's just start by defining an example of each of these scopes. So local would be like the very innermost scope and contains all of your local names. So if I define a variable as whatever, like I'm going to define a function called local, okay? And inside of here, I have a variable m equal to 7, and I'm going to say print m, okay? So this m has a value and properties within this local scope of this function that I just named local. Enclosing would be like it has your non-local names and non-global names. So if there's something outside of here where I also say, um, well, if we go outside of here, that changes something. So I will just say that anything enclosed inside of there is also considered enclosing. And if I were to go here, like I'll just make another comment to say, all right, so let me compare local versus global. All right, let's see here is we're going to define a function called local, okay? And I define this function, it's called local. All it does is set a value of 7 to the name m and then prints m. Now, um, we are going to define m within the global scope, and outside of my function, I'm going to say m equals 3. Okay, let me make this smaller so you can see. And then I'm again I'm going to call or execute, right? The function local, and I'm going to do that by just saying local with just an open and closed parenthesis. Okay. But after that, I'm also going to print m, and I want you to see what happens. So what does this do, you think? So this is where scopes come in, because if you code something and you get the answer you're looking for, then that means that your scope is correct. If you have something here like m defined outside of your function, this is outside of the scope of this. Therefore, it's a separate entity, really. M doesn't exist outside of here. until here. So this is really the first time my code has ever seen M globally. But inside of this function, it has seen M and it knows this because the local scope is what it's looking at here inside of my function. So if I run this, what do you think is going to happen? Well, I defined this. That doesn't do anything. It just says this is a function and this is what it does. Um, but it is going to say, okay, I have a function. I also have a variable M with a value of 3. And you want me to execute or call the function local. And then you want me to print M also. So what should happen is we should get 2 numbers back because it's going to execute this and return 7, but it's also going to execute print M, and globally it doesn't know what M is inside of here. It only knows this. So it's going to print 3. So we should see 7 and 3. So let's try this. So I've got, this is in core, so I got to go to example, and then I can see my core.py. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm just going to type Python core.py 7 3. So because of scoping, we were able to predict that that's exactly the output that we expected because of this being a local scope and this one being a global scope. So hopefully that makes sense. So when you're defining functions, you need to be careful of where you're defining variables, because if you're trying to reuse this variable later, then it may be better to define that globally. But sometimes when you define things globally, it really screws you up when you're trying to make a variable inside of a function locally. So there's decisions you have to make about, again, this is how you structure your code to go, where do my objects live? Where do those definitions live? Because I need these properties somewhere else down the road. So should I make this global, or is this something that I really just need inside of this function? And I may call this function a bunch of times, but this object only exists inside the function, so I can keep the scope local. Some people don't really encourage the use of global scope variables. Some people use them all the time, so you're gonna find a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about this, but um, it's not the point for you to make some sort of informed opinion about it right now. It's really just to make sure you understand the difference between the two, not whatever, whether or not you think that one is better than the other. So we talked about how Python reads this, or as we say, how it parses the file and the order and what we expected to see. Um, so hopefully that makes sense. But if it doesn't, let me know. And if you have any questions, I can answer those. So the other part of scoping that we're going to go over is if we removed this guy, right? So what happens if I remove this? I can comment it out or I can delete it. If you wanna delete your code to see what happens, you could do this, but you might forget what was here and then be like, oh, that didn't work. So sometimes it's better just to, um, if you want to remove something, just comment it out and then put like removing this line for testing purposes, right? And you could do something like that so that you could read this and be like, oh yeah, okay, so they were using this and then they removed it and tested it. Hopefully when you're done testing, you decide whether you want to keep it or not and just remove this line altogether if you don't. However, what we'll do is we're just going to remove this, okay? But we're also going to add something so we can see this. You can print multiple things if you separate them with commas. So I'm going to print M. So in this case, M was 7, now it's nothing, right? But I could also print a message like a string saying printing from the local scope, okay? And then down here, I could also say, let's see, printing from the global scope, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and just move this next to M so we can see them a little bit next to each other. and we don't need this anymore. I think we all get that. Okay, does that make sense? I think that's probably pretty good. So what do you think is going to happen? What do you think is going to happen? Well, let's see. 3 printing from the global scope, 3 printing from the local scope. So I define this function, and Python just reads it and goes, okay, cool, I have a function. And the next thing it does is say m is 3. Okay, got it, m is 3. Print m, okay, so 3, and printing from the global scope. So it says 3, printing from the global scope. The next thing it does is it goes to local and says run local. And it goes, okay, cool. So locally, I'm going to print m and printing from the local scope, but I didn't define m, right? And so it doesn't have an m, so it uses 3. Now, why did it do that? Because it went local, enclosing, global. Because let's eat green bananas goes 1, 2, 3, 4 in the steps. So if it doesn't find a variable in local, it will go to enclosing. If it doesn't find a variable in closing, it'll go to global. If it doesn't find it in global, it'll go to built-in, which is like the Python built-in stuff like print and local or print, define, like all the stuff that I'm typing out that, like, well, print is just a great example. And if it doesn't find there, it'll throw an error and say undefined name error because it doesn't know what the name of that thing is. And so when you see a name error, it's important to know why we call variables names, because if you know that that is a name, then when you get a name error, you know that that has something to do with a variable, right? And if I didn't define this, let's try not defining this. Let's say it's n, right? And you can see my code's already freaking out. Uh-oh, name error. Name m is not defined. So you can see right there. I can fix it, change it to m. Now it works. So that's pretty expected, right? When the function local is called, m is not found in the scope, so it goes outside, finds it global. Okay, now I know what m is, and then it just does the same thing twice. So what happens if we change this to like an enclosing function? So we haven't gone over enclosing yet. Let's talk about enclosing. So I'm just going to make a line right here, and actually I'll do it up here, and we can make one here. So let's make a comment. I'm just going to say local, enclosing, and global. So let's mix all 3. So I'm going to define a function, and I'm going to call it an enclosing function, and it takes a parameter of nothing right now, which I'll explain that later. And this time I'll say m is 13, and inside of this function, I'm going to define another function, local, just like we did before. Okay. And inside of local, I'm going to say print m blah, 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 like that, right? So define local, print m, printing from the local scope, right? So then you can see my editor has these lines. It makes it easier to see. Okay, let's see. In line with this, let's call this function. So what does enclosing function do? It sets m to 13, and then inside of it, it also has another function called local, and then it calls local. All right, and now outside of this, we're going to say m equals 5, and then we're going to print from the global scope. I'm going to kind of cut and paste and borrow from all this stuff. Boop. There. We'll just make one big thing. Okay, so after this prints, at the very end, it's going to say, okay, m is 13. I have an enclosing function here. So locally, m isn't defined, but I can see from local, it's going to go to enclosing. It's going to find m is 13, and it's going to go, okay, m is 13. It's going to print 13, printing from local scope. I call local, so calling this function would call m, or it would call 13, printing from local scope. Outside of here, it gets to m is 5, and it should just print 5, printing from global scope. So after this, I'm going to call my enclosing function. So what I expect to see is 5 printing from global scope, 13 printing from local scope. Would that make sense? Let's check and see. So I'm going to save this, and let's clear this and run 5 printing from global scope, 13 printing from local scope. But you can see here how locally inside of this function, m wasn't defined, so it's not going to find a local scope. It needs to go outside to the enclosing scope to find the value. So here we have a global defined variable of m equals 5, and it's going to print that because it knows this. And then the enclosing function doesn't need this global variable because inside of it, it's always going to start with local and work its way out. So you're not going to get 5. So if you actually did this and you're like, wait, I didn't want 13. How did I get 13? It's like, well, then maybe you just need to get rid of this. Because what happens if I get rid of this? If I comment this out, right? Now what happens? Well, now they're both 5 because it went from local, didn't find anything. Went to enclosing, didn't find anything. Went to global, here it is, it's 5. And so when this function was running, it found a 5 and it set it to 5. So that's essentially scopes. Again, it's a lot of information with an abstract concept to take as a beginner with Python. But if you're here doing this, hopefully you're just doing this to better yourself because you're not the kind of person that just sits and does the bare minimum. So maybe going with a more advanced approach at the beginning is a good thing. So let me know your feedback. We're almost done with this first chapter, and then we'll be getting into some actual coding stuff. But if you're following along and typing all these things yourselves, we jumped straight into this. We skipped hello world. We're sitting here talking about namespaces and scopes and stuff. So, uh, yeah, I'm interested to hear some feedback. I didn't learn Python like this, but I would be curious to see if you've never used Python. What's your take on it? What do you think? So, anyways, yeah, as always, let me know if you have any questions, and if not, I will see you in the next one.